This time in the deal, there came a point where I had an opportunity to stick it to this guy, and I knew that I had the opportunity. And the realtor came back to me and asked me a question, and somehow I just instinctively knew. And I told the realtor, I said, if he's willing to do that for this little amount of stuff, he obviously needs the money more than I do. Give him whatever it is he wants. I don't care. The realtor texted me back and he says, well, now that you've made that, let me tell you something. This guy has had to borrow money just to get this far in the closing. He's losing money. I mean, we were talking about putting caulking around the window. It cost $1.50, okay? And he refused to do it. So fast forward, we go to closing. The realtor says, just making small talk, asked the guy, are you going to the fair? He said, no, I can't afford to go to the fair. We go through closing. At the end of the closing, I look at the bottom line. The guy that I'm buying the house from had to pay at closing $1,500 just to sell the house. He didn't make a dime. He walked away from closing $1,500 poor and couldn't go to. If I wanted to give him $50 to go to the fair, but I didn't have any cash on me. If I'd had cash, I'd have given it to him. So my point is, God has used that exact thing that I used to do with a different heart and a different viewpoint. So it's not about being put in and taken out of the book of life. It's about, were you saved in the first place? And I think one of these weeks in the very near future, I'm going to teach on, I think it's called the parable of the four soils. And I'm going to teach, I try to teach on that once a year, because Jesus says in the New Testament, if you don't understand this parable, how you won't understand anything else that I teach on. So I try to go through there once a year so that people will see. Because here's one thing I've noticed. Because I listen to a lot of Bible teachers and a lot of Bible studies, and a lot of them try to put their own spin or their own interpretation on it. And part of going to Bible college is to learn that in the Bible certain words mean certain things. It's not open for interpretation. I can give you a couple of examples off the top of my head. The word live has two meanings in the Bible. One is a physical life and one is a spiritual life. Death in the Bible has two meanings. Physical death, spiritual death. Water has two meanings. It either means physical water or the Holy Spirit. A good Bible study teacher will not only be educated and know those things, but will have the Holy Spirit speaking to him to tell him which one it is. So whenever you hear a Bible study teacher pull something out of the air that sounds outrageous, it probably is. All right, so Psalm 83, long psalm, basic psalm. The heading of it says, prayer to frustrate conspiracy against Israel. So once again, Israel is in the crosshairs. Now, I use this picture in my class all the time. I don't know that I've done it on Facebook before, so I'm going to do it again. If you've seen this, please bear with me. But throughout the Old Testament, the relationship between Jews and God follow a unbelievably boring pattern. And as you read it, you think, first off, how could they be so stupid to make the same stupid mistake over and over and over, just like we do, by the way? And why does God tolerate it, just like he does with us, by the way? But it goes like this. I want you to picture a clock. At 12 o'clock, God and the Jews are on the same page. 3 o'clock, the Jews screw up and make God angry. 6 o'clock, God takes vengeance on his people. 9 o'clock, the Jews are begging for mercy. 12 o'clock, God answers, and the relationship is put back together between the Jews and God. And this goes on and on and on. And anytime the Jews are in, like this time, we're going to see that the clock is at 9 o'clock. The Jews are in trouble, and they're going to come to God and beg for help and forgiveness. So in that response, it is a typical psalm. It also says a psalm of Asaph. Asaph was a contemporary of King David. He was a musical leader, and also obviously a man of God, because he writes a number of psalms. So, okay, verse 1, do not keep silent, O God, and do not hold your peace, and do not be still, O God, for behold, your enemies make a tumult, and those who hate you have lifted up their head. Okay. So here's a couple of things that I notice when I read it. Which I find interesting. So they are praying, these humans are praying to a God, and they're telling this God what to do. Oh, you didn't hear that? Do not keep silent. It sounds to me like they're telling him what to do. Do not hold your peace. And do not be still. So I find it interesting that the ones that are in trouble, the ones that need to help, are telling God how to get done what they want done. Now, just a little aside here. In those days, kings would go out and fight in the season. That's just what kings did. That was one way they made money. If I went to my town next door and I fought with them and I conquered them, then I would get tribute from them, and that would be income for my people. Okay? So, fighting was a money maker. It's what they did. So when a kingdom like Moab, which is a huge kingdom, would win, all of the other countries would say that their God was on their side because they're winning all the time, and then these other countries' gods are being defeated. So it was not about the people, it wasn't about the kings or the fighting or the machinery, it was about the gods over the countries. And that's how it was looked at. And with the Jews, it was the same. Because now they're going to take their problems and try to make them God's problems. He says, for behold, God, your enemies make a tumult. They're making a noise. And those who hate you have lifted up their head. They have taken crafty counsel against your people, and consulted together against your sheltered ones. So what they're saying here is, okay, God, we're your people, and everybody knows that we're your peeps. If they can come in here, band together, and whip us, they're not just going to whip us. They're going to whip you. And you're going to be a laughing stock. And they're going to make their God bigger than you. They have said, come and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be remembered no more. Okay, now you know that God gave Israel that name. So that was something that really that would hit God in his heart. Verse 5. For they have consulted together with one consent. They form a confederacy against you. Now, do you think the kingdoms around there really got together and said, let's go beat up God? I don't think so. I think they built up a confederacy against the Jews. And Asaph and the Israelites are trying to make their problem God's problem so that God will step in. Now we're going to go through a long list of names here. And my original intent was to go through each one of these and tell you what happened to each one of these kingdoms. But rather than do that, here's what I want to do. As I read a name, I want you to ask yourself, do any of these countries exist today? Okay? It says the tents of Edom and the Ishmaelites. Is there a country called Edom in this world? No. How about Ishmael?
Changed, right?
The land is still there, but there's no Edomites.
No.
There's no Ishmaelites.
No.
What about Moab? Does Moab exist?
No.
No. And the Hagrites, Gabal, Ammon, Amalek. Do any of these places exist? Philistia. Now you could make an argument that that's Palestine, but I don't think so. With the inhabitants of Tyre. Does Tyre exist? Assyria. Assyria. Also joined with them. They have helped the children of Lot. Do any of those places exist? No. So obviously God stepped in and took care of them. And we're going to do another chapter here. Deal with them as with Midian. Does that exist? As with Sisera. As with Jabin and the brook Kishon, who perished at Endor, who became his refuse on the earth. Another way to say that would be, who became his garbage on the earth. Make their nobles like Orab and like Zeb. Yes, all the princes like Zeba and Zalmunna. Do we know any of these people? Who said, let us take for ourselves the pastures of God for a possession? Okay. Now here again is one thing that I find very interesting. The psalmist is assuming that the land of all of these people does not belong to God. Let's go back and read it. He said, so all these people got together and they said, let us take for ourselves the pastures of God for a possession. I'm sorry, but the land and the water and everything in them and on them was created by God, belongs to God. The land that the Moabs lived on, and the Siserites, the Ishmaelites, and the mosquito bites, they all live on God's green earth. But the psalmist is trying to make it personal. Then he goes to verse 13. Oh my God, make them like the whirling. Okay, so now the psalmist has put out the problem. All of these countries have gotten together. All of these countries are out to get them. And now and he's asked God to step in. They've made it personal. Okay, so now remember I've told you, when you pray in the Psalms, when they prayed in the Psalms, they were under law. They were not under grace. So under law, it was okay to pray for justice and retribution and payback, because that's what law is about. We're under grace. So we are not to pray like this. But what he's about to do is to tell God how to deal with these guys. rather than just put it in God's hands and says, go deal with this, please, he's going to tell him. Which was a righteous prayer back then. And he says, oh my God, make them like the whirling dust, like the chaff before the wind. If you've ever been on a farm and wheat or straw or hay, when you're bucking bales or bundling stuff up, what's left on the ground is called chaff. And when the wind blows through the barn and you're sweaty and you get all that all over you, that's the chaff. And that's what he's saying, grind these enemies up until they're just like dust. As the fire burns the woods, as the flame sets the mountains on fire, so pursue them with your tempest and frighten them with your storm. When I figure out how to get these pop-ups off of the screen, fill their faces with shame, that they may seek your name, O Lord. Okay. Now that to me is a righteous prayer. Fill their faces with shame, that they may seek your name. Remember how many times I've told you that when I pray, when I feel like somebody is after me spiritually, and I pray, that whatever they're praying against me would be done to them 10 times over. Not because I want them hurt, not because I want a retribution, but because I want them to know that the God they're praying to is nowhere near as strong as my God. My God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And whatever God you're praying to, he's no match. And I pray that they see that, know that, and understand that. So what he's praying is that God steps in and whips them so bad that they're going to say, that's the God that we want to follow, not our God. He goes on in verse 17, let them be confounded and dismayed forever. Yet let them be put to shame and perish, that they may know that you, whose name alone is the Lord, are the Most High over all the earth. Now notice he says, let them be confounded and dismayed forever. If I were praying that prayer today, I would take out the word forever. Yes, let them be put to shame and perish. If I were praying that today, I would take out the word perish. That they may know that you, whose name alone is the Lord, are the Most High over all the earth. Now here he acknowledges that he is over all the earth, where before he was saying that the enemies were coming to take the pastures of God, making the assumption that they live on ground that doesn't belong to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So the psalm itself was broken down into 3 basic parts. A plea for help. Then when they were talking about Israel's enemies, he was describing to God the reason that they were coming against him and why he was going to God asking for help. And then the last part is the petition for divine intervention to step in and help the Jews defeat all of their enemies. A typical psalm, a typical petition, typical position, but I never get tired of reading them or understanding them, because each one has its own special parts to it. Do we have any questions or comments? Okay,
You said the psalm was broken down into three basic parts.
right?
What were those again? I'm
Okay.
sorry.
The first part was a plea for help.
Hold on.
Okay.
The second part was a protest against Israel's enemies. And the third part was a petition for divine judgment. And that's a key word there. Do you want God judging you?
Yes.
I don't. Because if my behavior is judged, I'm going to hell. That's what my behavior deserves. And so when he's praying for judgment, remember, they're under law. There's no grace here. There's no forgiveness. Now, God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, right?
Yes.
So we know that if he destroyed nations before because they were coming after his people, don't you think that he would destroy people if they came after his people today? The answer is yes. And if you doubt me, look at the United States.
Yes.
30 years ago, and I'll just give you an example. 30 years ago, when Jimmy Carter was president, the speed limit on the highways was dropped to 55 miles an hour. There were fights at gas stations. There was gas lines. Jimmy Carter came on TV in a cardigan sweater and said, "Turn your thermostat down in the winter and up in the summer." We were made to believe that America was going to be at the hands and the mercy of the Arabs, and that life as we knew it was over as Americans. That was a picture that the Carter administration painted for us. Right? Okay. Here it is 30 years later, we finally got a conservative, and I'm not going to go political, but he lifted all the restrictions on the oil companies, and guess what? Inside of 3 years, the United States now produces more oil than anybody on the planet. We are a net exporter of oil in this country. Now, that didn't happen by accident. This country has been blessed. Don't you think that if God wanted to bless Saudi Arabia, that he would have kept the technology away from the United States and given it to them? Or gave them a leader who would bless the people with Christianity instead of trying to export Sharia law? God protects his people.
Yes, he does.
Throughout American history, and I am an avid fan of American history, every American general that I studied always prayed to God before they went into battle. If you doubt me, go watch the movie Patton. He was known as Blood and Guts. He had the mouth of a sailor. He was not a nice guy. But when he went into battle, he couldn't put together a prayer, but he had a preacher that he told the guy in gruff language, "We are going out tonight. It's snowing and the machines can't move, but we're leaving in the morning. I want you to come up with a prayer to make God have that happen."
No.
So the preacher put together a prayer, said the prayer, and guess what? The next morning the sun came out, the snow went away, and off went Blood and Guts and all the people. If God is for you, who could be against you? And I've told countless stories in this class of non-Christians who have come up against me personally, trying to attack me, which is normal. That's a good thing. That means at least Satan understands I'm carrying the ball. And when I pray for God to take over, I now pray for mercy because I've seen him totally destroy people immediately after I make that prayer. So now I make that prayer, but I say, please have mercy. They don't need to be destroyed. They just need to leave me alone. So God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. His righteousness, his view of right and wrong, is the same today as it was when these Jews are asking him to annihilate their enemies. We live under grace. I want to have grace.